Welcome to Why They Say No, an introduction to cognitive salience theory and environmental conflicts. I'm Zachary Lawson, and I'm happy to be here today presenting this original scholarly work as a master's student at George Mason University. This presentation will discuss my work towards the development and implementation of a conflict theory called cognitive salience. When considering the development of a new theory that is both highly useful and relevant to contemporary conflict, I chose to return to a theory that has been at the backbone of some of today's most important concepts. Social identity theory, developed in 1979 by Todgfell and Turner, is integral to the study of human behavior and as such is at the root of conflict scholarship. Despite the importance of social identity theory as a parent theory for significant works such as Vulcan's Chosen Trauma and Rothbart and Krostalina's continued examination of identity and violent conflict, there are still gaps in the theory that pose a key concern. In today's conflict environment, the facets of social identity theory are too broad to accommodate emerging conflict types that incorporate both qualitative and quantitative variables, such as environmental conflicts. With all this in mind, I arrived at the following question: what happens when identity comes under attack from accepted schools of thought and knowledge? With that question in mind, I turned to the concept of threat narratives, a theory interrelated with social identity, but with a more specific approach. According to Rothbart and Krostalina's research, threat narratives emerge to fill in uncertainties about an outgroup and can overpower an individual's identity to the point wherein they inevitably pass through the realm of moral rather than political or economic discourse, bearing far more cognitive heft than practical understanding. So what does this mean for our previous question about social identity? Well, primarily that threat narratives can shape social identity so much that they're the singular way of knowing for a particular group. People who have accepted a threat narrative as reality are more likely to reject other perspectives despite any amount of evidence or persuasion. At this point, we've drawn several conclusions between social identity theory and threat narratives, but have yet to look at the behavior of individuals rather than groups. How do the foundation of these concepts apply to individual behavior? So, we have two existing questions that are guiding the development of this theory. First, what happens when social identity is defined by threats? And second, how does this all apply to individuals versus parties at conflict? There is another important question that is essential to the development of any theory, and that is innovation. How can the result of the combination and modification of these theories contribute new perspectives to the field? In light of this, my goal was to contribute a new approach to applying qualitative methods within quantitative contexts. To do so, I decided to work within the framework of environmental science. Throughout my previous explorations of environmental conflicts, I have noticed a pattern of critical points where participants will choose to say no and reject any future consideration of evidence, hence the title of this presentation. I found it strikingly similar to the behavior of those who have adopted threat narratives and choose to reject any narratives, even true ones, in order to explain the behavior of outgroups in a way that preserves their own identity. Seeing a significant connection between these two phenomena, I decided I could develop a theory that explained the act of saying no, and perhaps could recommend strategies for saying yes in environmental conflicts. The following are 5 truths of the resulting theory, which I have named cognitive salience theory. The following slide will demonstrate these conclusions graphically, but I'll present them here as an introduction. First, when the proximity of perceived threat increases, the probability of identity salience increases while the probability of science salience decreases. Second, where the proximity of perceived threat is infinitely large, meaning distant, scientific arguments have the highest probability of salience. Third, the intersection of identity and science salience curves represent the critical point wherein cognitive dissonance consciously exists, meaning both constructs cannot be held true beyond that point. Fourth, for each increased distance between identity and science after the critical point, cognitive dissonance increases proportionally. Fifth, the critical point represents the emergence of conflict and in-group out-group behavior. It may be helpful to keep this in mind as we move on to the graphic representation of this theory. And here it is. The y-axis measures the probability of salience, meaning the likelihood that a given variable is more or less important to an individual. The x-axis measures the perceived proximity of threat, which means how close or far an individual perceives a threat to his or her identity. The two dependent variables are science and identity, the two realities at play in many environmental conflicts, and their curves represent the increase or decrease in salience as the perceived proximity of threat grows closer. The critical point, represented at the intersection of science and identity curves, is the point at which identity overcomes science in perceived salience. This point is unique to the individual, as his or her pre-existing knowledge of science, work experience within the field, the respect for the date presented, as well as general life experiences, will determine their starting level of salience and the slope of each curve. The perceived proximity of threat, the x-axis, is unique to each individual involved in the conflict, as it seeks to chart the perception of threat rather than the actual physical proximity. This requires a degree of specialization for each individual along the spectrum. At the origin of the graph, identity salience must be at its lowest in accordance with social identity theory, because there is no existing threat to the person's identity, which we know from Tajfel and Turner. As both the x and y axes are unique to the individuals, no two maps can be expected to be the same, and therefore the critical point will accordingly be different. This results in much of what I have observed in environmental conflicts: stalemates in dialogues, stonewalling, different priorities, and most often two parties arguing about two totally different things. This is quite a lot of information, so I've provided a hypothetical example to drive it home. A farmer with little scientific background who lives next to a site of a new but controversial method of mining will experience his critical moment sooner than an environmental scientist or engineer working on the project. The threat to the farmer's identity is physically and emotionally closer. Because of this, the environmental scientist and engineer are likely to continue researching the quantitative elements of their proposal because they view the science as the most salient issue, while the farmer sees his sense of self-preservation as most important and will likely be unmoved from his stance by reason of science. Cognitive dissonance also plays an enormous role in the development of cognitive salience theory. Cognitive dissonance emerges in consciousness when one belief, identity, becomes more salient than another, science, as a direct result of a shift in perceived proximity of threat. Note: as the perceived threat draws closer to a participant, the science and identity curves continue on their respective trajectories, resulting in a growing gap between the two beliefs. A visual representation of the strength and size of cognitive dissonance, or the tension between two competing beliefs or ideas, is shown through the growing circumferences of the circle tangents for each curve. As identity salience increases, protecting life, property, family, tradition, etc., and the science continues to justify the implementation of the threat, as it often does in environmental conflicts, science must decrease in salience as the two beliefs cannot coexist past a critical point. The proportional increase in cognitive dissonance, as shown by the radius of concentric circles that emerge as the tangents of the identity and science curves, represents the continued entrenchment of identity versus science, resulting in the rejection of science as a course of persuasion for threatened individuals. In order to demonstrate the utility of cognitive salience theory in real-world applications, I chose an ongoing environmental conflict as a framework. The uranium mining conflict in Virginia arose after uranium became a cost-effective domestic fuel source and a candidate for low carbon emission energy. It has been hailed as a potential key to unlocking the door to American sustainability and self-reliance. However, A moratorium exists in Virginia, which intends to halt mining until the effects of the mining process, specifically radioactive tailings left behind, called yellow cake, are fully investigated. The conflict that exists is between those who want to capitalize on uranium as a resource and those who are concerned about safety, location, and environmental threats. One prominent pro-mining group is Virginia Uranium Inc., who, although highly invested in their own research, which should be considered carefully, does point to outside research that claims any detriment to the environment from remaining uranium tailings left in the ground can be eradicated by concealment in underground structures approved by the EPA and U.S. Corps of Engineers. Conversely, many Virginia residents and the Southern Environmental Law Center claim that uranium mining poses many health and environmental risks, including contaminated drinking water for large Virginia cities and the volatile Virginia weather, as reasons to keep the ban on uranium mining in place, as well as citing the potential to ruin historic ecosystems along the Roanoke River with unforeseen consequences. The resulting narrative allows opponents of uranium mining to challenge science, despite the relative unfounded claims of the Southern Environmental Law Center. It allows residents in opposition to mining to defend their identities as inhabitants of untouched historic land, and in fact decreases their salience of science because they choose to reject empirical research in favor of claims that cause less cognitive dissonance. Because the evidence put forth by the Uranium Task Force studies, which concluded that uranium mining posed little to no threat to the general population or the environment and therefore should be lifted, justifies the very threat opponents are resisting. It cannot be used as a source of common ground for negotiations because participants who are close or past their critical point are not likely to engage in productive dialogues. Therefore, in the case of uranium mining in Virginia, it seems unlikely that science alone will persuade or dissuade participants from their current stances, as it is too threatening and too near the critical points for many opponents. Because it is clear that the solution will not be found solely on the science or identity curves, it seems prudent to examine participants who are willing to compromise before the critical point is reached. For example, the National Board of Earth Sciences and Resources submitted a peer-reviewed report pinpointing various areas of contention over lifting the moratorium. These included failure to provide economic viability, the potential health risks of miners and nearby populations, radiation exposure, the length of radioactivity of uranium mining tailings, and the inadequacy of current technology to accommodate them for more than 200 years, as well as the risk of natural disaster on radiation containment. However, the board does acknowledge best practices that exist for mitigating any existing risks. The question raised by the term best practices is which are most likely to fulfill the needs of both science and identity curves for the most people. Let's return to the original graph. As Figure 1 illustrates, any point to the left of the critical point represents an acceptable compromise for that individual, as the science remains more salient and cognitive dissonance is not yet present. Also represented in Figure 1, the further to the left of the critical point, the further away the proximity of the threat. Recall that perceived proximity of the threat describes mental and emotional proximity, not physical proximity. This suggests that further facilitation should be geared towards identifying alternative ways in which to increase the perceived proximity of the threat, thereby keeping any arguments to the left of the critical point. Furthermore, this requires proponents of uranium mining to be more creative and thorough in their line of reasoning, as the use of science to justify a threat to other participants may drive them closer to the critical point where negotiations are futile. In terms of understanding how people behave in environmental conflicts, cognitive salience theory is useful in that it combines existing social theories with the element of scientific qualitative variables. This is an important development in conflict theory because as environmental conflicts emerge at the forefront of domestic disputes, the stakes grow higher and conflicts grow more and more intracted. In fact, the debate over climate change that is becoming increasingly politicized and polarized may be the next place for examination through the lens of cognitive salience theory. Because of the many disputes over factual evidence regarding climate change and what, if anything, should or can be done about it, productive dialogue on the issue is at a standstill, a situation only made worse by the various priorities of involved parties. Furthermore, there are increasing demands for the United States to become self-sufficient in terms of energy and production, but there are vast disagreements over how to accomplish this, giving rise to tensions over topics such as uranium mining, oil, and natural gas pipelines. These disputes, gaps, and discrepancies can be mapped, analyzed, and understood using the framework of the cognitive salience theory, which can then shape best routes for negotiation and facilitation, as well as signal best practices for future policy regarding climate. It seems likely that most environmental conflicts may be better explored through this lens rather than the existing approach where companies merely buy a policy into existence or legislation hinders potentially beneficial environmental practices. But examining possible resolution through the process of best fit for a situation rather than the path of least resistance, future policies involving uranium mining and other environmental conflicts will be more effective and more agreeable. Perhaps we can protect our world and live in it too.